Welcome to the Football Talk Squadron. I'm Dutch.
And I'm Maul.
And this is episode 3 where we're going to review all things college football. You know, and to start off this episode, I figured for our guests, the player, taking a look at the past and present, I'd go some bigger name schools, but I think a little bit difficult on the player.
Okay.
But you may get them.
Okay.
So first guy, schools Tennessee.
Okay.
First team's Texans. Second team's Dolphins. Now,
Texans as in Oilers or Texans?
the Houston Texans.
Okay, so he was Tennessee, so then recent-ish with Texans instead of Oilers.
Yep.
And then you said Dolphins.
Yep. Now, he only did 1 year with the Dolphins. So, the Dolphins is sort of an outlier.
Arian Foster?
Dude, what a guess. I was about to, because I was waiting for you to be like, what year was he drafted? And that's the real kicker. Undrafted.
Really?
Yeah. Out of 09.
Yeah.
Dude, what a guess.
He was kind of came out of nowhere, but he was one of those where when you watch him play, like the first guy never brought him down. He was, I mean, poor guy was on the Texans. He was one of those guys, like if he wasn't on the Texans, he would have probably had a longer career, but he just got beat up so much because he was on the Texans. But he was so elusive. Like I remember when I played running back, like in high school, it was like Gale Sayers and Arian Foster. Like those are the dudes like I wanted to look like I was running after because his smoothness of his stroke, like his gait when he's walking was just it was something else.
I just remember in fantasy, like for that few years, like between like 2010 and 2012, like he was the number one guy. And I think it was like I think it was 13. He like blew out his knee in the preseason. I want to say, like, I just remember he got hurt.
Yeah.
And it was after fantasy drafts had already occurred. Like most people are already taking him number one. He gets hurt and you're just like, oh, and that injury derailed him.
Yeah.
Because he was just never the same player.
Unfortunate.
Coming back. But yeah, tremendous player, but even better guess. Like dude, I'm pumped. This one, I get this is he's more of a star in the NFL now.
Okay.
Justin Tucker. And I get he's a kicker, but in my opinion, like the greatest kicker to have ever lived. But where did he go to school?
Penn State?
Nope. It was a Big 12 school. It's
Iowa
surprising.
State.
No.
I have no idea.
Texas.
Really?
Which is
I would have never guessed that.
No, not in a million. Which I think it's most kickers, like, unless they, like, miss a kick in the national championship. Yeah. No one knows their names. Like, you're just like, who's this guy? But now that he's as big as he is in the NFL, you know, you had to talk about him. For this episode, we just want to, you know, I'm going to speak a lot to the SEC. We both know all of the different conferences, but especially you'll probably see that we are a little bit more biased towards the SEC, towards the Pac-12, in just terms of our knowledge. We're going to keep it unbiased in terms of who we think is going to go. You know, it may be that Alabama, USC makes our Final Four for the CFP predictions, but ultimately it's really trying to be based upon what we think. And I think you'll see that throughout the season, that ultimately it's just actually giving football talk, but want it to be open and honest in terms of who our actual teams are going forward in the season. So, bringing it up, we'll pull up a picture for you guys to see just the AP poll top 45 preseason, which we talked about before, absolutely worthless.
I hate preseason rankings. They're completely biased and they mean nothing. However, they set a precedent for the rest of the year, and we can get into this, but I'll just talk about it right now, of like why they don't mean anything and how it changes the rankings for the rest of the year. Texas A&M is a perfect example.
Yeah, number 23 on.
There's no reason that they even deserve to be ranked number 23. They were ranked, I think, 6th at the beginning of last year.
And then App State came calling.
They were terrible, right? And they start losing to people in the beginning of the year, and instead of them being like, oh, maybe Texas A&M just isn't that good, they start ranking these other teams who are beating Texas A&M because they do this look-back thing all the time, and they're like, oh, they beat the number 6 team in the nation. Let's rank them. And when in reality, it was just like, Texas A&M was terrible. They don't deserve to be ranked again this year, but yet again they are.
Which it is open in front. I mean, it's a SEC bias. Like if Texas A&M wasn't in the SEC, they're not getting the look that they're getting this year.
Yeah.
Now you can sit back and you say, "Oh, it's part of being ESPN, hold the market." 100% valid, but it's also just being a part of the SEC. The fact that the SEC's won so many national titles, they're going to get more looks because it's a focal factor. Now, should that happen? Like you said, absolutely not. Like Texas A&M does not deserve to be in the top 25 going into the season. In fact, they have, I would argue, the most to prove of any top 25 team just based upon how bad they were last. They didn't make a bowl game last year.
What they have, 4 wins? 5 wins?
I think it was 5.
Yeah.
But they didn't make a bowl game.
Yeah, they didn't deserve to. And yet here they are at number 23.
Number 23. Which ultimately, especially when you take a look at the list, like you got Oklahoma at 20, Texas at 11, both of which I think are way too high for, especially Oklahoma. Oklahoma is in the top 25 in my opinion because of that brand name. I get that they're in the Big 12 and there's not a ton of schools in the Big 12 that are going to produce this year. However, in the grand scheme of college football, last year you look at Oklahoma was not a good team. Like, Venables will coach a defense, but when they lost Caleb Williams, they're not the same offensive team that you remember.
Well, and this is my big thing with preseason rankings and the way the NCAA does things right now. Everybody's big thing with the college football playoff is like get the 4 best teams in the college football playoff, right? And I'm not against that in the the heart of it. I do think that you need to have won your conference and all that stuff, and we can get into that later. But like to just say, oh, the 4 best teams should get in, but then you have these rankings based off of just because they're brand names essentially it's counterintuitive and it doesn't make sense. And the NCAA is going in a direction that makes it hard to be a fan for real because they don't do things based in logic anymore. Like, I know people didn't like the BCS, but it was a computer and it used logic of like how we're ranking things and based on who you want and strength of schedule and all that.
Points and now you've got all these other things.
Yeah, now you got this committee who I swear half the guys probably don't even watch some of the games, and they're ranking teams based on what they think is going to make good business decisions and good TV, and it's not truly the best teams that are getting ranked.
Yeah, and I think that last year, for me, I know we talked about this before, not on the podcast, but when you take a look at the last year's CFP, you've got Georgia playing Ohio State, Michigan playing TCU. In my opinion, after TCU lost
to Kansas State,
okay, yeah. I would have argued that if like we can talk differently about whether TCU belonged in it. I think they did based upon a multitude of different factors. They won their division. Bama had 2 losses. I know that was the next team out. But in terms of if you had to put Ohio State or TCU on the neutral field, who's going to win? I think everyone would have picked Ohio State. But yet Ohio State, should have been playing. They should have been the number 3 team playing Michigan that week instead of TCU, but the committee changed it.
Business decisions because of that whole thing, and I get it. And it's going to sound like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth here, but I agree. Like the TCU Georgia matchup was one that people didn't necessarily want to see, but at the end of the day, that's why we play the game. They go out and they beat Michigan, right? Like you can't take it away from them. Yeah, did they get pummeled in the national championship? Fine. That's just the way it goes. You can't say that it should have been another way, though, because they beat Michigan in order to do it.
Oh, I'm just saying that in terms of not whether TCU should have gotten in, just that Ohio State should have been ranked higher than TCU so that TCU played Georgia first, and then they wanted to save the possibility of an Ohio State-Michigan for the championship game instead of it playing out the way that it did.
And I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm of the mindset, and I can't wait till we go to the 12-team playoff because I'm of the mindset that, like, honestly, they would have both still made it probably, but they wouldn't have been ranked where they were. Ohio State wouldn't have been there because they didn't win their conference. Kansas State wouldn't have been there. TCU wouldn't have been there because they didn't win their conference, right? Like, you can't say that you're one of the top 4 teams in the nation if you didn't win your conference. You know what I mean? Like,
Well, Tulane would have been one of the top 4 teams in the new playoff.
Yeah,
because
right. But people would have had a conniption fit if Tulane was ranked number 4 and made it to the national, the college football playoff, right? They'd be like, "Who's Tulane?" They'd have freaked out. That's why.
But that door opens with the 12 team, which will be better for all of college football ultimately. But how we're going to break this down is we're going to go Power 5 divisions only. Sorry, Mountain West and the MAC and everything else. Ultimately, if your team starts to show up, sort of like Cincinnati did a few years ago, we'll start talking about you more. But ultimately, the issue with most of those outlying conferences, you don't play enough top 25 teams in a season, much less if you do at all.
Kind of like Georgia.
Yeah, well, facts. We'll get to that here in a second. But you don't have a schedule that justifies even being in a consideration for going to the CFP.
Yeah, I mean, you're just, even if you go undefeated, like you said, like you're not going to have enough big name wins that are going to consider you to get ranked up here.
Yeah, and so now bigger news this offseason was the Pac-12. If the conference that we're going to, the Pac-4 Pack It Up conference, as I like to say, I mean, just totally done, which I think that you can speak a lot to of how that happened for people out there who don't really understand it. I don't think it has anything to do with how good they want it to go to the Big Ten. It was how bad the Pac-12 was managed from the standpoint of marketing.
Yeah, I mean, as a Pac-12 fan who lives on the East Coast, it's impossible to watch games.
For sure.
Because it's either, one, not even on TV, which is just a foul, right? Like, you can't even find it. You have to be subscribed to, like, the Pac-12 network.
Which they don't carry on the East Coast.
They don't offer anywhere other than in that market. Or the game's on at, like, 10:30 at night Eastern or something like that. You know what I mean? So, like, it's midnight by the time the first quarter's over. Like, nobody's staying up to watch that game unless you're a true fan. And they're just... You can have great games that happen, but nobody sees it. So nobody even recognizes a team that's good or, hey, they're up and coming. They might be a challenger because all they're reading is the box score Sunday morning when they wake up.
Yeah, when you wake up, you're turning in to be like, oh, who even played last night?
Exactly.
What's the score? So ultimately that led to it. However, the first conference we're going to talk about is that if you had told me, hey, in 2023 a conference is going to get blown up, I would have been like, oh, it's the Big 12. Big 12's going to win. Because after Texas and Oklahoma said they were going to move to the SEC, I would have thought it fell apart. Now, ultimately, they brought in a few other teams. They brought in Cincinnati. They're bringing in UCF. They still have Texas this year and Oklahoma. They will officially move next year. But in BYU, they added them as well, and Houston. So there's 4 teams that they're adding. They're about to lose 2 with
It feels
Oklahoma.
very Big East kind of. You remember the Big East, like in basketball?
Yeah, before it blew up. Yeah.
Like it feels very like that. Like,
and ultimately, they're probably going to get a few more teams. Like the Pac-12's done. Like it's just a matter of who picks up Stanford and Cal. Who's going to be that conference that goes and grabs those schools. But ultimately, this year we won't look at sort of who that's going to be. It's just sort of who we think out of the Big 12, that we think is going to compete, or at least has the attention right now of possibly competing.
See, I feel like if anything, the Pac-12 is still a bigger name brand on the West Coast. So instead of those teams leaving, they're probably just going to fill the blank space with teams over on that side of the country, like San Jose State or Hawaii or San Diego State. Teams like that will probably end up just filling the rest of the pack, whatever number they get to, Pac-10, Pac-8, Pac-12, whatever, however many.
The Mountain West Conference is what they need to merge with.
Yeah.
And pull that conference is pulling it. I think Hawaii's in the Mountain West now. That would be a smart move. They're not going to have the big names of USC and UCLA, Oregon, but ultimately you're going to have to do
Boise
something.
State.
Well, yeah, it will have Boise. And I mean, San Diego State is a good football team every decade.
It is. It's just sad though, like watching in front of our eyes the Pac-12, one of the Power 5 prolific conferences. Maybe not the last 5-10 years, but over the history have produced plenty of champions. Watching it in real life blow up in front of our eyes.
It's done. So. But taking a look at the Big 12, I think the first team that comes to mind with the Big 12 that a lot of people I mean, they're the highest ranked in terms of what you look at in terms of the top 25 is Texas. Taking a look at their schedule, we're going to find out a lot about Texas and, for that matter, Bama week 2, which I think it means way more to Texas than it does to Bama for this reason. Bama loses to Texas, but wins out and plays Georgia in the SEC championship and wins. Bama's in, no one questions it.
Yeah.
For Texas, if they lose to Bama, even if they win out, they're still going to the Big 12 championship.
They're going to have to fight for it, though. They're going to have to try to have other people lose in certain situations. They need some help.
Yeah, and ultimately, sorry, I had to bend down in order to get a little fact sheet because this is where I'm at with Texas, and it comes down to Steve Sarkisian. So I wanted to just prove this out and talk about it just for a little bit because there's a lot of hype about Texas going, and this is my argument as to why not. So Steve Sarkisian as a head coach. So he Washington for 5 years, goes to USC, does a full season, then gets fired because, can't be drunk on the job.
Tequila Steve.
And then this is his 3rd season going into Texas. So Washington starts off 5-7. Then he goes 7-6, 7-6, 7-6, 8-4. So not stellar by any means in terms of where you would think going undefeated or something that would lead you to the USC gig. But then he gets USC. So he goes 9-4 first year. Then he goes 3-2 before getting fired. Now he's at Texas. First season, 5-7, 8-5. My man in his entire head coaching career has never not lost less than 4 games.
Yeah.
And I just sit back and I look, and it showed last year.
I mean, that's fine. You're not going to win. You're not going to the championship.
Correct.
It's just not happening.
And that's my biggest argument for Texas is that until they can go in and beat Bama, and trust me, everyone's going to be like, Texas is back. And I'm here to tell you right now, Texas isn't back. You can throw the flag on that. Because ultimately, when you look at their schedule, they're going to lose to some team like BYU or at Houston. Like they'll beat a good school like Bama or a big name like Oklahoma, but then they will struggle with a team that they have no business losing to, and that's ultimately what kills Texas every single year is they just can't go undefeated. And ultimately right now with the 14 playoff, that's what you got to do. So, I take a look at their schedule. Ultimately, I still think the same thing. That it's at best a 3-loss season for Texas.
I think they have the best opportunity of a Big 12 team to make it out of the Big 12 to the college football playoff, but big ask. They've got to beat Bama. That's like they could lose to Bama. Excuse me. They could lose to Bama and still make it if other things happened. They got some help, but if they can run the table, which means they beat Bama, again, it's one of those brand things of just like they are kind of on the up and coming and everybody's excited about them. So if they run the table, I think they can get in.
Oh, if they run the table, they're in automatically. No questions asked with Texas. The other schools, Oklahoma, it hurt Georgia's schedule big time because Georgia's not playing anyone. They were supposed to play Oklahoma. It got pulled by the SEC because of Oklahoma coming into the division next year, so they pulled that game from them. But when you look at Oklahoma in terms of just their schedule, they have no ability to mess up anywhere because there's no other big names outside of the Big 12.
That's the problem with the rest of the Big 12. Like, really, even Texas's schedule, they've got some good Big 12 matchups, but outside of Bama, like the Big 12's problem is strength of schedule right now.
100%. And until that changes, it's one of those conferences where you can't afford to drop more than one game because you're done.
Yeah.
Because whoever you lose to, the likelihood of them being like the TCU that goes undefeated in the Big 12, they sort of kill one another throughout the season. That ultimately you're like, oh yeah, well they lost. They had a bad loss to Iowa State. And it's like Iowa State sitting there at like 6-6, going in, down the stretch, and you're like, well, Iowa State's not a great team, and it kills them going throughout. So ultimately, I think Oklahoma's on the downhill in terms of a program.
Yeah. Well, they've been on the downhill the last few years.
Once Lincoln Riley left,
yeah. Well,
had that conference because of their talent they could do offensively, I get it. You go get Brent Venables because he can coach a defense, and that's what was always lacking at Oklahoma. But now you're really putting a lot on him to go find that offensive coordinator, and it's tough. And heads up, you're going in now into a conference where it's going to get even tougher.
The Big 12, they had 2 Heisman-winning quarterbacks, right? Like, the Big 12 is also not really known for their defensive play. So they were able to produce those prolific quarterback, Heisman-winning quarterbacks because they also didn't play a whole lot of defense, right? So if they're trying to make it outside of the Big 12, they need to step up that side of their game in order to compete outside of just, the Big 12.
100%, which I think it's a type of squad that I can easily see like 7-5 out of. It's 7-6,
Yeah, when I did all my rankings, I ranked them in like tier systems of like the best opportunity. So Texas was number 1 tier, and then I put Oklahoma and TCU in tier 3. Like not even a tier 2, they're a tier 3.
Which, TCU, this is the thing, we've talked about it in other formats, but I think that you bring up a great point. Anytime that you look at the season prior, and especially you look at TCU that had a great season last year, go get all the way to the national championship game, they had a ton of games that came down to the very end, and it went their way.
Yeah, and TCU had to come back from those games.
Yes.
Like it wasn't like they were winning and it was just close. They had to come back.
Baylor, these games that you sit back and it worked out for TCU, the probability that works out the
from
next
a historical standpoint, it's not going to happen again.
Not going to happen. And so I sit back, I look at TCU. We'll talk about this team that I'm about to mention here in a second. Not that they're not competing, but I feel like we'd have to talk about them just to sort of set the record straight on how we feel, which is Colorado. They open up with Colorado, but then for the rest of the time, you sort of look at their schedule, and yet again, it's same as Oklahoma. If TCU doesn't win out, they're not getting in.
No chance.
And it's because you don't have a good non-conference schedule out there. It's just them. So for them, they have to go undefeated as well in order to even think about it. That's just my personal opinion. Do I think it happen? No, I don't see it happening. Just because it's tough to win that many games in one score. You lose your quarterback. You lost a lot of talent last year from TCU, and this year no one's sitting back not gazing over TCU. They're going to be there's a target on their back going into this season. So I just don't see it. But the other team that is, before we get to Colorado, is Kansas State. I get it. They get blown out by Bama, but at the end of the day, they did beat TCU. It was the second time they played them. They are ranked. I take a look at their schedule. It's the exact same thing. You really have to question whether or not, the Big 12 is even going to get a team in, just because I think that throughout the course of the year, Texas, Oklahoma, TCU, and Kansas State beat one another.
Yeah, they're all going to beat one. There's going to be a round robin of wins somewhere in there. And again, the only one that I can think of surviving any of that would be Texas if they can beat Bama, right?
Yeah.
Texas can beat Bama, survive one of those losses in some fashion, or one or the other, and still have a chance or maybe be in the discussion. But if any of the other teams have any of the losses, they don't have anybody else on their schedule to look back on and go, oh, but we beat these guys, so they're out.
100%. And then for Colorado, or we'll get to Colorado here in a second when we get to the Pack It Up conference, but I keep thinking Big 12 because that's where they're going eventually. But, taking a look at the Big 12, we started off with them, and then the next conference I think has a lot of hype for one particular school this year, which is Florida State out of the ACC. There's a few schools in the ACC that I think have a good potential, which is Notre Dame. And it's because of Notre Dame's schedule, not because of how good I think they're going to be this year. I think that they will beat expectations of last year because of them getting the Wake Forest quarterback.
Yeah.
He is the real deal. I think he'll play very well. But when you look at Notre Dame's schedule, they have I would argue, the hardest schedule in college football this year.
It's that double-edged sword right now in college football of do you play a hard schedule to show how good you are by beating all these schools, or do you take the Georgia, Alabama route of we're going to play a bunch of really easy schools knowing we're going to beat everybody, but we're just going to stay undefeated knowing that just because we're Georgia or Alabama, we're going to get in. So Notre Dame doesn't necessarily have that ability to say like, hey, we're just going to get in because we're Notre Dame, because they haven't been that good as of late. So they've taken the other route and going, we're going to play and potentially beat 3 of the possible Power 5 conference champions.
Yeah. So for those of you who aren't looking at their schedule, the 3 that we're talking about, the very first one that they're going to end up playing in their schedule, which isn't until week 6, is Ohio State. So they get, or actually week 5 for Ohio State. And then a few weeks later, they're getting USC. And then a few weeks later, they go to Clemson. You know, they get Ohio State and USC at home, which is good for Notre Dame. But if they win all 3 of those games, and now they could afford to lose to a low, I don't see them beating those 3 teams and then dropping it to like, you know, NC State or something. I think that they handle their business throughout the year. But my argument would be that if Notre Dame goes undefeated and Georgia's undefeated, Notre Dame's the number 1 team in the nation. And it's because
I don't disagree that they should be, but I could almost guarantee that they won't be if that was the case. I just, if Georgia doesn't lose, which they won't, there's no way that the committee is taking them out of the number 1 spot. And I will say the only way I do see that happening is that they can somehow try to get like an SEC all final.
I just sit back and if Georgia goes undefeated and wins the SEC, they're either going through Bama or LSU. And that will be their only big win outside of Tennessee. Notre Dame sitting there undefeated. As long as Ohio State's good, USC and Clemson are the teams that we think that they're going to be. I don't see how you don't put them number 1.
I agree. I'm not saying I think they should. I just don't think the committee does that because of the way the committee does things.
Now the real question is do I see this happening?
No.
Like that's ultimate. Sorry, Notre Dame fans. The issue with Notre Dame is that the last time they went undefeated was 2012, and then they got it absolutely handed to them in
Bama
with the national championship. I sit back and I look at Notre Dame, and yes, they're going to have a good quarterback. They have a few weeks to prep before they get Ohio State, but I mean, after Ohio State, you do have 2 lesser teams in Duke and then at Louisville, but the next 4 games, super tough. USC at home versus Pitt. Pittsburgh's always good. Like they're one of those teams that they may not win the ACC, but
they're upsetters.
Yes,
yeah,
you're going to get their shot every time that you play them. And then they have to go to Clemson, which I don't think Clemson's the same team that we saw under Lawrence or Watson. I think that they are on the downhill too, but they're still a good enough team that going in there, which I guarantee you is going to be at night, it's going to be a tough place to play.
100%.
And then Wake Forest. Wake Forest is yet again another one of those teams that they find ways to beat you. Like they may not go undefeated, and they're probably like a 7-6 ball club. But every once in a while, Wake Forest shows up, and you're just like, dude, this is a good football team. So ultimately, I don't see it with Notre Dame going undefeated. With Clemson, who's next in the ACC, I think that it's between them and Florida State. My biggest issue with Florida State is Florida State this year, I would say, is the most hyped team in all of college football.
And they have, a good opener to prove it with LSU.
Oh,
if
for
they
sure.
can come out in week 1 and beat LSU, that hype is just going to continue.
If that happens, then the matchup with Clemson is really pivotal. Because taking a look at Clemson's schedule, ultimately they get Florida State after they go to Duke, play Charleston Southern, the school of the blind there in Charleston, Florida Athletic, and then Florida State. So ultimately they have 3 good weeks to get a really good warm-up before they get Florida State at home, which for me, Florida State at home, that is that's the pinnacle of Florida State season. I agree with you with LSU in terms of if Florida State wants to make a statement that we have no doubt to belong, they have to beat LSU to start the season off.
Yeah.
But I think the hardest game for them is going into Clemson, because last year Clemson, let's be honest, was not the same Clemson. They get smacked by Notre Dame. They proved that they were not a great football team last year. and Florida State couldn't beat them at Florida State. This year they have to go to Clemson. That will define their season.
Yeah, I mean that's the one of the big things that's different between college and pros. Like home games and away games matter in the pros, but not like it matters in college. Like college is a very different atmosphere when you're at home versus away.
And it's not just when you're at home. We're going to get to this when we get to the SEC schedule, because there's a game that if it's not at night under the lights, I want the state to burn down the SEC headquarters in Birmingham, because it should make them that mad. I guarantee you that when Clemson plays Florida State, it's at night. And anyone who's ever been to any type of college football game, you play a game at noon or 3:30, and you compare that to when the lights are out.
Oh yeah,
completely different ball game.
Atmosphere is huge in college.
And if you want to know where the best place to go to watch a night game, it's Baton Rouge. Like there are 100,000 people who honestly haven't been sober since last August, and they are riled up. Like that is one of the most electrifying places to go play a football game is Baton Rouge, and it changes the game. When they are not at night, it's a different stadium. So for me, if they play Clemson at night, if Florida State wins, good on them. Don't see it happening. That's where I think Florida State stumbles. But ultimately, you take a look at Florida State's schedule. Outside of Florida State and Clemson, at Florida.
You mean LSU and Clemson?
Yes, excuse me, LSU and Clemson, like the at Florida. I don't.
Yeah, so this is what I was going to talk about with Florida State is they almost have to beat LSU, because even if they lose to LSU but then somehow beat Clemson, they might win the ACC. But their schedule is so weak that they're going to be like, look, you already lost to LSU, who's probably going to be like, I don't know, third in the SEC. It's not building a strong case to make the playoff. You know what I mean? When they go purely on like, oh, who we think the best team is, it's going to be hard to say that possibly the ACC championship is better than like the third place SEC guy if they couldn't even have beat them in week one. Now, I know week one is like a long time away from when they're making those predictions. So if they lose and LSU has a really good year and then Florida State runs the table and is looking strong at the end of the year, maybe. But again, it won't bode well for them because their schedule after LSU and Clemson is not very good.
Correct. It's one of those ones that we see this every single year, that as we get closer to the committee, we're revealing the top four. We've yet to have a year where there's 5 undefeateds. Like each of the Power 5 schools is undefeated, and they're really like, honestly, it is coming down to your schedule to where you're like, who did these teams actually play?
Well, it was almost like that last year, not with the undefeated thing, but it was like everybody had losses. At the end, and it was like, man, how do we decide? Which is going to be, would almost be the exact same thing if nobody had losses. You know what I mean?
100%. Yeah, it's a great point.
And look how it turned out. Everybody was just like, there was so much debate on like who should get in, who shouldn't, and all that. And that's why I don't like the subjectivity that gets introduced with the committee, because they only get to pick 4, and it's so hard to compare two schools when they've never played similar opponents.
And it's one of those we talked about this earlier, just as a little side note. The conferences themselves, I think that every single conference, you have your teams that you sit back and you're like, these are the best teams of this particular conference. And we're going to go through each of those teams. However, it's that middle group that really sort of defines the conference that we really don't ever focus on. And I agree with you. You said this to me off camera. The SEC gets a lot of bias that what's the SEC? And I get it. The SEC, in terms of when you take a look, especially we were talking about watching the Florida doc, really since that time that Florida won the Natty, the SEC's been on a roll that no one else has matched. And so it gets a lot of credit because of the champions that come out of the SEC. But in terms of this idea that all SEC teams are better than all other teams, it's false.
There's a bell curve in every single conference. You have the 1 or 2 really prolific good teams that can compete, and then there's kind of everybody else. And then there's like the 2 bottom Vanderbilt type teams.
Yeah. I mean, because I think about it last year that you have teams that are sitting back and they're like, well, they beat Texas A&M. And it's like, well, Texas A&M didn't play anyone.
No, like they were terrible.
And the only non-conference game they had, I think, was App State.
But because because they were preseason ranked number 6, they do this backwards looking like, oh, well, we beat the number. It just doesn't make any sense.
And I think that's the only positive that if we get to super conferences that happen is more interconference play. Like instead of starting off like with playing,
UT Martin or Ball State,
School of the Blind from Colorado Mines, like you just sit back and you're like, if y'all would play, and I'm not saying that you have to go play Ohio State every week, but just have Vanderbilt go play Rutgers. That way you sort of know Mississippi State go play Northwestern or Iowa. Like if those schools played one another more often, then you'd be able to justify a little bit more that you're like, hey, look, like Mississippi State's a little bit better than you think. They beat 3 of these teams. Yeah, they didn't beat Alabama, but they did beat the teams below Ohio State and Michigan in the Big Ten. Those are the type of things I'd like to see, but ultimately we'll see how that shakes out down the road. The other 2 teams that I think we're talking, or really 3 teams. I think it's 3 teams in the ACC that you sit back and you go, these are the type of teams that can upset a season, but I don't think at any point you go, they're going to be in the Natty, which is Wake Forest, NC State, and UNC. All 3 schools, good football teams, but at no point I don't think that anyone would have them picking to win the ACC.
I wouldn't put UNC in there.
Okay,
but I do think, and Wake, I would have said Wake with their quarterback, but he went to Notre Dame, so I don't even think really that they're going to be that competitive this year. I do agree with NC State. I think NC State gets slept on. I think Louisville can be again, not someone who's going to win the ACC, but somebody who can upset somebody else from winning the ACC.
Yeah, and it will be interesting to see how those teams play out. I think that ultimately, it's the Pinstripe Bowl for most of them, but at no point I don't think they're cracking the top 10 in terms of the CFP outside of
Notre Dame, who I kind of still consider independent. Who do you think is going to win the ACC? Or, who do you think has the best shot, again, outside of Notre Dame? Because if they run the table, they're in because of how they play, what their schedule is. But, who are the other teams then?
If Florida State played Clemson at Florida State this year, I'd say Florida State's going to win the ACC. But due to them going to Clemson, I've got Clemson. That's just outside of Notre Dame. I think Notre Dame wins the ACC this year.
Okay.
But if you had to say who do I think that they're playing against, it's Clemson.
Okay.
And it's just because I don't think Florida State has gotten to that point. I can be totally wrong, and I'll eat it at the end of the year if I am. I just don't see them with their team going into Death Valley and beating Clemson that night. But that's just me. We'll see. Oh, that will be the biggest test. That's why I say I don't really care about the LSU game. I think it matters to the committee, and it will matter there at the end. But in terms of the make or break point for Florida State season, will come at Clemson.
It's fair. But
then we got the Big Ten, which ultimately for me, it comes down to 2 teams. It's the game. It's Ohio State, Michigan.
It's the East. That whoever wins the East wins the conference.
This is where I get super upset looking at the Big Ten because I hear it every single year. Last year I heard it. Ohio State loses to Michigan. And they sit back and they're justifying Ohio State getting in. And they're like, well, they beat Penn State. Well, then you look at Penn State and you're like, well, who's Penn State beat? Nobody.
Yeah, Penn State has been Michigan and Ohio State's leap-in game every single season.
It's a resume builder.
It is. They're just there to say that Michigan and Ohio State had beat them. Oh, look, we beat Penn State. And again, it's one of those. They're not a bad team. I'm not saying they don't deserve to be ranked because they usually are a decent team, but they're never really that threat to Are they really going to take the Big Ten this year? No.
And it's the same. I mean, when you take a look at sort of the Big Ten and other schools, the other big one that's ranked is Wisconsin. Usually Michigan State's always a player. Iowa will usually beat someone during the year. But I take a look at those teams, and it's ultimately it's between Michigan and Ohio State. Now, I personally think, and I get this is where this recency bias comes into play with a poll, I would put Michigan number 1.
Yeah.
And it's because of who they're returning. And this isn't a shot at Georgia. it more speaks to the talent that's returning to Michigan. Michigan is returning what I would argue is the best backfield in all of college football.
They're good
this year. And their quarterback's coming back. Something that Alabama and Georgia of the SEC can't say. And I don't think teams understand. It's not
Ohio State.
Ohio State's not bringing back.
All getting new quarterbacks.
100%. And that Clemson, for the most part, I get it. He's got some game experience. But based upon, he was not, you can't look at Clemson's quarterback last year and compare him to Watson or Lawrence because he didn't look like that. Clemson still has enough ballers, and he struggled. So I don't see that happening. But in terms of Michigan this year, it's Michigan's to lose.
For sure.
In my opinion. My biggest question with Michigan is the game seems to define Michigan's season against Ohio State. It's like everything they work for is beating Ohio State, and it's this huge rush, and then they get into the CFP, and they absolutely blow it.
Losing to TCU.
Yeah, losing to TCU, and I get both times. The first time was against Georgia, and Georgia turned out to be the national champion. You sit back and you watch them, and you're just like, it's clear that it was this letdown game. It was like whoever played Michigan after Ohio State's probably going to beat Michigan because it was the pinnacle of their season.
It's the hangover game that you talk about. Like, you get so hyped up for that one game, and when you finally get through it, you're like, whoo, and relax, and then you get sideswiped.
So I sit back, I take a look at Michigan's schedule. Ultimately, when you take a look at most outside of Ohio State playing Notre Dame, there isn't. This is yet again, it's just these resume builders of within their own conference, which I have a real heartburn over because you can't really prove how good your conference is against other conferences. You can't sit back and be like, well, we beat, Maryland and we beat Penn State. It's like, cool. Yeah, so did other schools. They beat the teams in their conferences. But if you lose a game, like if Ohio State loses to more than just Michigan, they're not getting in.
No.
In Michigan, I look at their schedule and it's like East Carolina, UNLV, Bowling Green, Rutgers, Nebraska, Minnesota, Indiana, Michigan State, Purdue, Penn State, Maryland, Ohio State. It's the game. We'll see how Penn State's doing by the time that it gets to November 11th. Do I think Penn State's undefeated with 3 weeks to go in the season? No. Penn State's going to lose a game. Guaranteed. That's James Franklin's resume. James Franklin is going to – he'll blow a game at some point during that season that they shouldn't lose, to Maryland.
So this is my thing with the Big Ten as well. Wisconsin is an interesting team for me because they don't play hardly anybody on the west side. So they could theoretically – and hear me out on this one. They could theoretically – go undefeated, meet Michigan or Ohio State in the Big Ten championship and win and be undefeated and be the Big Ten champ, but still not make the college football playoff. And here's how I see it. That seems unreasonable, but here's how I see it. Let's say USC goes undefeated and wins the Pac-12.
Okay.
They're in.
Yep.
Georgia goes undefeated, wins the SEC.
They're in.
Texas beats Bama, goes undefeated, wins the Big 12. They're in. Florida State or Clemson. Let's call it Florida State. Florida State beats LSU week 1, goes undefeated, beats Clemson, wins the ACC. They're probably in too. They're probably not putting Wisconsin in over any of those teams.
I think you're right.
So, and that just it's a totally cherry-picked scenario, but it kind of goes at what I'm talking about with the Big Ten of it really doesn't matter who wins the West because they're going to lose to Michigan or Ohio State. And then, even if it's someone like Purdue and comes out and pulls an upset, it's really just it comes down to Michigan or Ohio State. And some of it is biased, but some of it is just those are the only two really good teams out of that conference.
100%. It's those two teams. But then I think the biggest conference that I'll talk about in terms of the teams that I think has the most teams that could possibly go in, it's not the SEC. It's the Pac-12.
Just in terms of
competing for the CFP.
Yeah, it's up for grabs.
Yes.
Yeah, big time.
Because, you take a look at the Pac-12 right now, for sure, I think the number one team that everyone's thinking about is USC because of Caleb Williams, which is justified. Wins the Heisman. Their biggest question is one thing, and I'll I told you this going into last year. It's
defense.
Yeah, can
obviously
Lincoln Riley figure out how to coach defense?
So we want to give them credit, right? That was their first year. That was Lincoln Riley's first year as a head coach. Like, to come in and put together that season, although USC is obviously a prolific, nationally known powerhouse, they haven't been very good as of late.
Yeah, for sure.
So for him to come in season 1 and have an absolute turnaround year where they could have made the playoff, right? Like, all they had to do was beat Utah in the Pac-12 championship, and they could have. They really could have if they just had some defense. But to have turned around that dramatically in year 1 says a lot. So we're excited for year 2, right?
It helps their program tremendously in terms of he did exactly what I told you he needed to do to get USC to the point that they're at right now, which if they came out and balled out, and him winning the Heisman, getting Caleb Williams there helps them on the recruiting trail.
Yeah.
Because that's ultimately where USC's been losing. Like, speaking as a Bama fan, you have Najee Harris.
Just the Pac-12 in general,
Yes.
right? Like, they're seeing the SEC win national championship. When I say they, I'm talking about like players growing up, kids in high school who are like going to these colleges. They're watching the SEC win national championship after national championship after national championship, and they're not even seeing anybody in the Pac-12 on TV because you can't watch any of the games. Who do you think they're going to go to when it comes to recruiting time?
Which is saying something when you're pulling your star guys out of California to come to the East Coast to play.
That's huge.
And until USC changes that on the recruiting trail, like, that's ultimately defensively where they have to get to, is they have to be able to keep their stars.
Now, USC has the best ability to do that because of who they are and their history, but they got to get good first.
And I argue that USC is in the best spot of all colleges with NIL. And for this reason, they're in LA.
It's Hollywood, baby.
Yes. Like, you look at Alabama, Tuscaloosa, Georgia, Athens, Ohio State, Columbus, Clemson, Clemson, South Carolina. Like, I mean, it's these bigger schools. It's not that it's a terrible small town, but when you compare it to LA, it's not a town. You might as well be a one stoplight city. So the ability of these kids to go, it's why Jordan Addison went to USC. Believe me, it had nothing to do with USC. It had everything to do with, I guarantee you, the second that guy walked in the door, he was probably $5 to $10 million richer. Legally.
Yeah.
Like, all these car dealerships, like, you can go, there's probably 6 Lamborghini dealerships in LA alone. There's not one in probably the whole state of Alabama. Like, that's just pure facts. So when you take a look at their ability to recruit and get star kids to go there, USC holds the key.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of can they put it together. But when you take a look at the Pac-12, you got USC, you've got Washington, you've got Oregon. Those other 2 schools, I would argue, and Utah.
Yeah, let's not forget about back-to-back Pac-12 champs.
And they deserve it.
Yeah.
They have Utah is one of those teams.
Whittingham is a fantastic coach.
Yes.
I mean, he's another one of those guys that just, like, the instant he shows up somewhere, they immediately get better.
100%. They're so well disciplined.
Yes.
Like, you don't see them commit a lot of penalties. They go out, they execute, and it's old school football. Like, just run it down your throat, play just.
And Cam Rising's coming back.
How he comes back from the injury will be big. It's tough to see him go down in the Rose Bowl. It was, yet again, it was one of those things where it's like, it's sort of that hangover game that it's like they beat USC, they kept them from going to the CFP. They get to the Rose Bowl game, and it was just sort of like a letdown because it was like their mission had been accomplished, and then when Cam got hurt, it was sort of over. But taking a look at Washington's schedule, at least they have the out of conference they get Boise to open up the schedule, State, and then they get Michigan State. I get outside of that, there's not a lot of teams from
out of conference,
but you at least play 2 known schools. Like, it's not.
Yeah. It's not Ball State or UT Martin.
Yeah, 100%. So, but and this is sort of the thing, the Pac-12 really doesn't heat up until the back end of
the season.
Yes.
And this is the one big thing about the Pac-12 this year that it's probably going to end up hurting the Pac-12, honestly, if you want my honest opinion, as opposed to last season. Last year, they didn't really all play each other. Like USC didn't play Washington or Oregon. This year, they play Utah, Oregon, and Washington. Washington plays Oregon. Like, they all play each other this year, which is going to, again, probably end up hurting them because it's just hard to survive that kind of gauntlet at the end of the season. So they're probably all going to, round robin beat each other, which, if someone's not undefeated out of the Pac-12, they're probably not sending someone to the CFP.
Yeah, and when you look at USC's schedule, and we'll sort of go through each of these. I mean, USC, October 14th, goes to Notre Dame. Then they get Utah at home, go to Cal, which is sort of a meh. But then
it'll be a good break.
It's 2 hard weeks, and then you get Washington at home at Oregon. Like, that's a tough – that 5 weeks will define each of their seasons.
And then just finish it off. I know UCLA is not, like, really supposed to be anything special this year, but, I mean, that's one of those games every single year. It doesn't matter who's, number one in the polls and who's not ranked. Like, they play each other hard every single season. Like, it's always a good – because it's just such a big rivalry game. So, I mean, that's, 6 out of the last 7 weeks of just straight grinding.
Yeah.
I mean, if you can survive that, I mean, good luck.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, Washington's in the same boat. So ultimately they get Oregon a little bit sooner on October 14th, but it's really November 4th their schedule takes off because it's at USC versus Utah. I argue at Oregon State. Like
one of the hardest places to play in college football.
100%.
Corvallis at night, dude. Corvallis at night. I have nightmares as a USC fan of Corvallis at night.
They always find a way to show up, and they have great running. Like I still remember Jaquil Rogers,
Steven Jackson.
Steven Jackson,
yeah.
like both of those guys. Like you take a step back and look at them, and you're like, dude, these are the guys that they produce, and they always have that special talent that just for some reason that one game, like he takes off.
They show up with career games, and they end up beating somebody they didn't have any business beating.
100%. So ultimately, with Washington. And whether it's Washington, Oregon, USC, Utah, all of theirs, they have anywhere from a 3 to 4 week stretch of games that you sit back and you're like, the Pac-12 will be defined by the end of the season. The last thing we'll talk about out of the Pac-12, just because I feel like they're getting undue hype this year, which is Colorado.
Oh, yeah. Don't get me wrong. I like watching it. It's good TV. But this isn't like, they won one game last year, right? Like, just because you got a new coach doesn't all of a sudden make you that much better of a team. So I know he's bringing in a lot of players, and they're probably going to do a lot better than one game, but it's all hype at this point.
I mean, I look at their schedule. They go to TCU, and I'm going to call it a loss. I think they start off the year on the road, and they get beat. They should beat Nebraska. Colorado State, they should beat. I think they lose to Oregon, lose to USC, beat Arizona State. Stanford.
That's a toss-up.
It really is.
Yeah.
Like, I would give the edge to Colorado and it's not really like me praising Colorado. It's just how bad Stanford's got. Like, you take a look at the history of Stanford with Luck and Christian McCaffrey and some of those guys, and you're just like, where has that gone? Like, it's no longer the school. They lose to UCLA, lose to Oregon State, beat Arizona, lose to Washington State, lose to Utah. So, in total, I've got them winning, I think, 1, 2, 3, 4 games. Like, that's it. I don't see them.
Yeah, they're going to be sub 500.
Yes. This idea, and I don't think he's going to turn it around either. Like, he may in the Big 12 because ultimately they'll have less competition.
Now, I mean, give them some time, right? Like, you get someone like Dion in there who's going to bring in players just because they want to play for Dion. Give it some time. I think he can turn it around.
In terms of him winning, like competing for a national title, no.
Not in the next
2
or 3 years. I mean, give him at least 4.
What I'm about to say is the reason for this.
He's going to leave before.
Yes.
Yeah.
Colorado is not his dream job.
No.
Colorado is a stepping stone. All Dion has to prove is that he can elevate Colorado, and he will get hired, and he won't be at Colorado anymore.
That's fair.
Because the second his son graduates and goes on to the NFL, he has no ties
gone.
holding him.
Yeah.
Like, the second a bigger school opens the door, and they will, because it's someone like, a perfect school. This would burn Florida State fans permanently.
Florida?
Yes.
Yeah.
Florida's going to be wanting a head coach here soon. I guarantee you, Bill Napier's not the answer. They're going to continue to lose. And when they do, I guarantee you, as much as it would pain Florida State fans, they'll call Deion. Now, whether Deion goes or not, I would argue he does, just because you're not going to turn down that type of money that a school's going to pay you. But we'll see. That's a prediction. If that comes true, then I'll preach it from the mountains going forward. Finally, the next is the SEC. And this is a conference that I really think it only comes down to 4 teams. So 4. In terms of,
you probably have Tennessee in there.
In terms of not the CFP, but going to the conference championship. So, and the reason I say this with Tennessee at it, the thing I don't respect about Tennessee is their defense. Like, defensively, you look at, I get it. They beat Bama last year, but they also gave up, I think, 49 points. It wasn't that you just stopped Bama. Bama moved the ball all night.
Well, old boy had the best game of his life, too, with all of his touchdowns.
Oh, Jalen Hyatt, yeah. But then they go into Georgia. Georgia just slaps them. Silly. And then
South Carolina
beats the brakes off of Tennessee.
Yeah.
Like, I don't care who Tennessee. It had nothing to do with Hendon Hooker getting
Beamer
hurt.
ball, baby.
Yeah, Beamer ball was on point that night. I sit back and I look at Tennessee, and it's ultimately, and this is where I was referencing that game. Tennessee should only care about one game this year, and that's Georgia.
Yeah.
November 16th or November 18th. If Georgia is undefeated, and let's say Tennessee is either undefeated or has one loss, because I don't see them beating Bama at Tuscaloosa.
Not again. Yeah, it's not going to happen.
If there's a game that's circled on the schedule for Bama that there's going to be some revenge out for, it will be that game. And they don't play Bama early. They play them a little bit later in the year, where Bama, I think, will have things figured out. We'll talk about sort of how I think Bama's going to do. But if Georgia and them go play, and it's as big of a game as I think it will be, and it's not under the lights at Neyland, burn it down. Because if they play at noon, it's not the same game. Neyland at night, as Bama found out, it's incredibly tough to play at. These type of national spotlight games need to happen, and that for me is one of the biggest ones that I have to sit back and say Tennessee has to play Georgia underneath the lights, because if they do, it's a completely different ballgame.
Yeah, it'll probably. I mean, I don't see it being any other way. I could see Tennessee not necessarily being undefeated, but they may have one loss. But it'll probably Georgia's going to be undefeated. Tennessee should probably have one loss. They're going to hype it up. It should be under the lights. Which
I want to say this like softly. This is not like my Bama bias coming through with what I'm about to say, but the reason that I'm saying Georgia's going to be undefeated has nothing to do with the fact of how good Georgia is. It's how easy that schedule is.
They've got 2 games. South Carolina in like week 3.
Yep.
And then Tennessee at the end of the season.
And Ole Miss if you want to throw it out, but I personally wouldn't. I mean, you look at it, UT Martin start off, then Ball State, then South Carolina. They'll get South Carolina. That's the only good thing about where they play South Carolina.
I was going to say South Carolina could be one of those shocker teams, but because they're playing them week 3 after 2 kind of cupcake games, that's going to be like them finally getting going, and it's just unfortunate for South Carolina. They're going to get in the way.
Yeah. UAB at Auburn, Kentucky at Vanderbilt. Like, you literally are just feasting on the bottom of the SEC. Versus Florida, Missouri, versus Ole Miss, at Tennessee, at Georgia Tech.
And, I know Ole Miss is looking up there right now, like, they're the number 22. By that time, Ole Miss could be unranked. You know what I mean?
100%.
Like, stuff like that can happen. That's why I don't, the preseason rankings, I've already talked about it, but
you just don't
that
put
might
a lot
not
of
even be a game by the time that's.
Here's my thing for Georgia. In this, when you take, we were talking about this earlier, when you take both sides apart and you say, I'm not going to remember that Georgia just won back-to-back. You just look at them on paper. In my opinion, there is no difference between Alabama and Georgia. And it's for this reason. Both schools, brand new quarterbacks.
Yep. Which is obviously a big deal.
Huge deal.
Yeah.
Both schools reworked offensive lines. Like, as powerful as Georgia has been offensive line, and don't get me wrong, each school has the talent to step in. It's just a matter of does it happen? Because let me tell you, Kirby Smart's been recruiting it this way for a long time. But before these two back-to-back national champions, you saw a school that struggled with quarterback. And don't get me wrong, they had Jake Fromm that did good, but couldn't get him over the hump. They had Fields, let him go to keep Fromm. But before him, it was Eason. They were hurting. And the other thing that both Bama and Georgia are dealing with this year, it's new offensive coordinators.
Yep.
And I already spoke to it heavily. I hated Bill O'Brien with a passion. It was because, like, from a creativity standpoint, when you watch Lane Kiffin and Steve Serkis,
Lane Kiffin's a mastermind. Offense.
What they do, I had an old ball coach that said this, and it's something I live by. A good coach doesn't make players fit their system. He builds a system that fits his players. And that's what Kiffin does. Kiffin uses the talent he has, even at Ole Miss or FAU, every school he's been at, even Bama when he was offensive coordinator, he puts guys in positions that it creates matchups. Because at the end of the day, it's sort of why those offenses don't work in the NFL, because everyone is just that good.
Yeah.
He's finding that guy that's like, hey, man.
The mismatches.
Yeah, I get you're at Georgia, but you're not the 5-star at corner on the number 3 wide receiver at Bama going against the number 3 corner at Georgia. It's a mismatch. And those are the things that he emphasized. That's where I sit back, and it's a big question for Bama and Georgia going into this offseason is how do these new offensive coordinators go? How do I give it right now? If I'm going to give an edge, I give it to Georgia. And it's because of their schedule. If I had to pick a team to go undefeated in the SEC, it's Georgia.
Yeah, and I know Georgia fans are going to sit there like I'm hating on them or whatever, and I get it. It's the way that they do their schedules out in advance, and they have contracts of we're going to play so many games, one at home, one at away, and all those different things. I'm not hating on the schedule. If I was Georgia, I'd be doing the exact same thing. I'm a back-to-back national champion. I'm in the SEC. All I got to do is show up and survive every week, and I'm guaranteed the number 1 spot, and I'm in the college football playoff. Now, that might come back to bite them if they get lazy and, Bama shows up in the SEC championship, and that's the first time they're playing anybody with a little bit of talent, and they get shocked. But, again, I'm not blaming Georgia for what they're doing. We're just pointing out the fact that their schedule is really easy this year.
And just to add on to that, I know that it's going to sound like speaking out of both sides. For Georgia, here's my argument, and I'll prove it real quick. At some point, Carson Beck's going to be tested. I think that they can win on their defensive line through the majority of their schedule, but at some point, they're going to have to rely on their quarterback to win them the game. And you take a look at the past 2 years, like ultimately Stetson Bennett was a huge question mark, like going into the year that they beat Bama in the national championship, mainly because Stetson couldn't win the big game. Like, could not beat Bama. Kirby couldn't beat Bama. It was a huge thing. And when the Alabama was winning that national championship game, and then going into the fourth quarter, what did Georgia do? They found a way to win the game. And Bennett threw a great touchdown pass in the corner. They beat Bama. And it was because Bennett stepped up. Following year, Missouri.
Dude, Missouri had their number. It was written on the wall. You could tell. It was just when you're watching that game, it was like at first you're kind of just like, oh man, we need to get it together. Oh man, they're like struggling. And like by halftime, you're like, dude, is this that game? Like if it had that feeling where you're like, oh my God, we're about to Clemson.
Yeah, Clemson. And you sit back and Stetson took him down the field, and
he showed up.
Yes, and that's where I don't think that no matter what school you are, you can sit back and you can be like, oh, we have a starter. You don't know who that kid is until you get him under the lights when it really, really matters. Because at some point, both for Bama and for Georgia, you're going to have to rely on your quarterback to win that game.
They better hope that that time is not at Tennessee under the lights, because that is a hard time and place to show up.
That is the only game, in my opinion, that if Georgia was to lose, and that's why I mentioned Tennessee, that's where I think it is. And it's because of the circumstance. I sort of look at the other teams, and it's mainly because I just don't could at Auburn happen in a 1 in 100 time? Yes, it's because of Hugh Freeze. Believe me, I think Auburn's getting a lot of hate this year in terms of their ranking, not in terms that they're going to be going undefeated or competing in the SEC. It's more about the fact that Hugh Freeze will open up that playbook.
Yeah.
Like, they will call everything under the sun.
Because they got nothing to lose.
Nothing to lose.
They're
like,
just...
No one's expecting them to compete. So when you go play them, you're going to get their best shot. Now, whether or not that works out in a win, for Auburn, I doubt it.
Probably not, yeah.
But I think that they test some teams. It's not – I personally think Florida is hurting. Like, it's just – it's not – it's funny after watching – Swamp Kings, it's not the Urban Meyer Gators.
No.
And it's I would argue it's not even the Dan Mullen Gators that beat Kirby. Like, this is one of the lowest that Florida's been. It's sort of like post Spurrier before Urban.
Yeah.
Like, that's where Florida's at right now. Like, Florida needs a new ball coach to come in there to revitalize things, and Bill Napier isn't it.
It's just, again, one of those self-licking ice cream cones things. Well, with like, why would you go to Florida when you can go to Georgia or Alabama, right?
Or LSU.
If you're that talented where you're getting recruited by those teams, like, why would you pick Florida right now?
The thing that helps Florida, and this is the thing, Florida can always beat someone, and it's because Florida is the mecca of athletes coming out of high school.
The state.
The state itself, produces more kids than anyone else. Like, if you're going to go get a guy that's talented, it's out of Florida. Like, that's where most of the guys come from. So Florida has a lot of just hometown kids that maybe they didn't get to go to Georgia. They weren't the 5-star, they were the 3-star, but they're still really, really good athletes, and that's why Florida shocks people. They won't shock anyone this year. They're going to get beat like a drum.
Yeah.
But ultimately, that's it.
So you want to talk about Alabama now?
Yeah, I'll talk about Alabama. For me, being a Bama fan, we were talking earlier. I'm not saying the dynasty is dead, but to say that the dynasty's not dying would be an understatement. Is eventually all teams have this huge peak, which I would argue Bama has been longer on that spectrum. But you think about us growing up, Miami, was going undefeated like every year. Miami's nowhere now. USC, going undefeated year after year, Heisman Trophy winners. They're coming back now.
But there was a long stretch there where they were
10 to 15 year period.
Yeah.
As long as Saban is the head coach there, they'll be fine. They will still be Bama in terms of they're going to be a team that's by no means is anyone going in thinking we got this game won. Like, that is the type of team that they're going to get. However, when I look at Bama's schedule this year, I get quarterback's a huge thing. This is going to give some fans some heartburn. I can see them dropping a total of 4 games.
Wow.
On their schedule of a possibility.
You think if they drop 4 games, Saban's continues
to be Saban's last year.
You think? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Saban will leave when he doesn't think that he can.
So that's kind of what I was going to get at is, like, how many more years of, like, being good and ranked but, like, just not making the playoffs does Saban continue to stick around for before he hangs it up?
He doesn't. Okay. Like, he's either competing or he's not. Like, and I think, I hate saying this. This will sound awful, and I mean it with, like, all respect. Saban will go out like Bear. When Saban quits football, like, I wouldn't be surprised if he's dead a few months later. And it's because, like, anyone that's been around Bama understands that, like, that is that man's life. Football is all that matters. Like, that is what drives him and wakes him.
State. The whole state is driven by that.
It's funny
because there's nothing else to do.
I told my wife the other day that it's God and Nick Saban. And she's like, well, for a lot of families, it's Nick Saban and then God. Yeah. Like,
yeah,
that's how much power he has. Do I think that they lose 4 games? No. And that's because it's Bama.
So who are the 4, though? You think
for me, it's Texas is the big, and it's because it's so early. Do I think it happens? No.
They almost dropped it last year.
They almost did, and that's the reason why I really like Quentin Ewers. Like, he is a good quarter. And that guy, before he got hurt against Bama, was lighting Bama up. Now, it will be a different defense for everyone out there, because I know Bama fans are sitting there yelling at the screen right now. Pete Golding's gone, and I hated Golding as a defensive. I am so glad that both our offensive and defensive coordinators left. Kevin Steele's back, and Steele is going to bring back that old school Bama defense, like where they are head hunters.
Didn't y'all lose a lot of people, though, on defense this last year?
They lost Will Anderson, who's the big piece. Now, I could get into a whole rant about Will Anderson, which is I don't want to say that he was overhyped, but he was overhyped in terms of.
It just didn't seem like he showed up as big of a player as he was in those really big games.
Yes.
There could be games where he disappeared.
The Tennessee game is a key one.
Yeah.
Like you sit back and you look at Tennessee and you go, where was Will Anderson all night?
Keep waiting for him to show up, and you're like, where is he? Is he hurt? Like, how come he's not getting a sack every other play like you normally see him do? And
I get it. Golding had him dropping in coverage sometimes. And now, does that happen? 100%. I mean, even the greats like Lawrence Taylor dropped in coverage. But you let your guys who are best at rushing the passer go rush. Yeah. And I think that what happened early in the Tennessee game was Hendon Hooker was running, and so they were like, look, don't try to get him, just try to contain him. And when you did that, the secondary wasn't good enough to man up, and they got torched all night long. So I sit back and I go, Texas is a big game for them because of the fact that it's so early. You don't know what you have with Bama.
You're still working out some kinks, maybe.
Which funny is, a lot of people don't, outside of Bama fans, Saban's only won 2 titles undefeated. So the first one in 2009, undefeated with Ingram, and the second one was during COVID. Bama has always, outside of that, has always had 1 loss.
Well, yeah, the one year they won it, they didn't even win the SEC. Correct. They weren't even in the SEC championship game because they lost to Georgia and Auburn.
Well, they lost to Auburn there at the end, but they beat Georgia in the national championship. That was the 2 a year.
Yeah.
So you sit back and you look at that game. They go into Auburn, lose. Auburn loses to Georgia in the SEC championship. Bama sneaks in at that number 4, ends up winning it all that year, which that's the thing with Bama. The only hope that you have of keeping Bama out is one of two, either 2 losses or they lose late in the year.
Yeah.
That hurts Bama. The next school, which I just talked a ton of crap of them, and it's not so much that I think that much better team. It's the fact that, as you called it, the Manziel nightmares, Texas A&M has always played Bama tough. Like you...
I said you have PTSD from Manziel days.
I was there when that happened. I remember 2 years ago, Bryce Young and them go lose in College Station. Last year, it took a goal line stand there at the end.
Yeah, and we already talked about how Texas A&M was terrible last year. So
now I get it. Bryce Young wasn't playing that game. It was Milroe. There are some things for Bama that I think that over the course of the year, I would not be surprised. I think it was Greg McElroy or someone else talk about it. Like, I could see them going into halftime against Mississippi State or Middle Tennessee on their first game, like 16-6. Like, and people were like, told you Bama's bad. Like, this is going to work out. And they could drop to Texas. But I guarantee you by the end of that year, no one on God's green earth wants to play Bama. Because that's how Bama usually works. As the year goes along, they build. And by the end of the year, no one wants to play them. So,
well, I mean, isn't it just like history keeps repeating itself? Whoever beats Bama, they usually have to play Mississippi State the next week. Yeah. So based on that schedule, Ole Miss is going to beat Bama this year.
Yeah, and then
poor Mississippi State gets to take the heat for the.
Shout out to my comedian Matt Mitchell. He did a skit where he was just like, "Oh, they lost.
Hate to be the guy who plays them next. Oh wait,
yeah, yo, it's me." The other 2 schools that I think that Bama could lose to is this. And these are more, the last one that I'll say is more doomsday. I think that this one is just, it's tough because it's LSU. I think LSU's a good ball team.
Yeah.
They have a returning quarterback. They have a good system. They lost a lot of wide receiver talent, but it's LSU. Like, they're going to regain all those guys back. I would say that it's limited in them beating them because I find that the Tennessee game and LSU both are at home. I would side on the side that says they don't lose those games because it's at Tuscaloosa. But if the possibility happened that Bama's already dropped 2 games and they're out of contention,
Iron Bowl.
Yeah. And it's because at that point, I don't think Hugh Freeze has anything to lose.
It's the exact same thing I said with USC, UCLA. Like, it doesn't matter who's ranked who and where. Like, those games are always just tough.
Which Saban, against first-year Auburn coaches, has struggled. You take a look at the guy that they ended up firing, it took them 4 overtimes to beat him. Manziel or Gus Malzahn.
Yeah, Malzahn, yeah.
Beat him. Like, you look at sort of guys that come in to Auburn, and that's sort of the thing is I think that first year, most of the time, Auburn's not a great football team. They're not competing for the CFP, but it makes the Auburn head coaching job to beat Bama, and that is their national championship.
Oh, yeah.
So
they can survive a terrible season if they can just beat Bama.
So they'll swing. That's sort of my prediction. I'll talk about prediction when we'll get to them here in a minute of just who we have going through each. LSU's the next team with the SEC. Ultimately for LSU, I really do think it comes down to the Florida State game in terms of how their season goes because of last year. I think that if they lose to Florida State again this year, they will come out gunning for Florida State. Like if LSU wins that game, I think it's something stupid like 52-10. Like,
oh yeah, I mean, I don't think that happens, but I could see it happening.
But my prediction is, if LSU wins, it's not close. I think that they beat the brakes off of FSU. Like, that's the only way I see that game going down. It's either close and Florida State wins, or LSU just beats them out of the stadium. That's me personally. And if the latter happens, which I think it does, I think Florida State beats LSU to start the season off and has this like tremendous high,
and then just tanks,
lose to Clemson,
and then it weakens LSU's schedule.
Yep.
Yeah,
and that's how it plays. But I think that if LSU does that and they lose early, that's where it starts getting harder for LSU going forward. That's just my opinion. And ultimately, I think that you take a look at LSU. I get it. I'm not trying to just bury LSU being a Bama fan. They were overrated last year.
LSU was?
Yes. Like,
how do you figure?
Dude, they lost to A&M. They're at the end. Lost to one of the worst teams in all of college football. And then Georgia, it was like they did not even show up to that game, which I get. Georgia is a good school, but in terms of like how they played, like LSU got away with beating Bama, and they deserved it. I'm not taking anything away from them. But when you look at sort of who LSU was that whole season, like they got the brakes beat off them by Tennessee. You look at the school as a whole, and I sit back and I go, dude, LSU was not that great of a football team last year.
That's a good point, because, I mean, I fell for it. I thought LSU was...
At least I'm about 95% sure. Let me take a look real quick as I'm sitting here looking at it of LSU's schedule last year, because I know that they dropped some games there at the end. Maybe it wasn't against what I remember is they lose to Florida State, and then there at the end
Bama was a big win for them.
They lose to A&M 23-38. Like, LSU lost to A&M last year.
Yeah,
that's
pretty bad.
Now they got destroyed by Georgia. The game that they almost lost is they went to Arkansas and they barely, because that was what Bama needed. Bama needed LSU to lose twice in the last 3 games, and they beat Arkansas 13-10.
Wow.
And Arkansas would have won that game if Jefferson had started. But they had a quarterback in there who, bless his heart, like, my man didn't look like he had played the position before, like was struggling hardcore. Like they were just, it was not a day for Arkansas. And that's my thing. I'm not a Brian Kelly fan. I'll preach that from now till the day I die. I have no respect for the guy. Like, I don't think he's that great of a football coach. I think he's been at some programs like Notre Dame that, he's taken them to places, but in terms of big games, Brian Kelly doesn't do it.
Yeah.
Like, he's never been that guy that consistently can win the big game. That's just me. But taking a look for us, Big 12, who do you got in terms of what do you think the conference – we'll go into the conference championships and what you sort of think.
Well, I mean, again, I've already talked about the tier system of Texas is number 1.
Okay.
And, then you're looking at like Oklahoma and TCU as like a tier 3. So ultimately, Texas is from a who can take the conference and possibly compete, it's really only Texas in my mind.
I think Texas goes, but I'm going to throw a wild card out there. just for the sake of argument. In my opinion, Oklahoma State's the team that they play in the conference championship. I think it's one of those ones that's not about how good Oklahoma State is. I think it's just how many other teams lose a bunch. I think they lose. The Big 12 sort of kills one another throughout the year. I'm going to throw out Oklahoma State. That's just sort of who I think comes out. I think they beat Oklahoma. I think they handle their business against TCU and Kansas State. I can see Oklahoma State going with like 2 to 3 losses to the Big 12 championship and playing Texas. Ultimately, I still think Texas comes out of the Big 12 this year as the champion. ACC, who you got?
I'm going to take Florida State.
Wow.
And it's simply just because they've got the hype. They've already beat LSU, so, that's going to be a tough game. But I just see Clemson on the decline and Florida State on, the rise. So I think they have the best opportunity, schedule included, to, run the table and then really show up as a CFP contender.
See, I think Notre Dame, when you take a look at their schedule, the only ACC school that they play of really significance is Clemson.
I'm not.
So they can lose to Ohio State, lose to USC, and still that doesn't affect their ability to play in that conference championship.
That's fair. I could see them winning the ACC. I just think they don't survive that amount of games. Like they don't have the. I don't think they're going to beat Ohio State, USC, and Clemson. You know what I mean? Like,
well, I'm just talking ACC championship.
Yeah, no, that's fair.
For me, that's where I see the ACC. Like, I think Florida State drops it to Clemson and keeps them out, and it's a one-loss, Clemson, because I think Notre Dame beats them during the season. They play Notre Dame, who then is undefeated in ACC play. Notre Dame's not undefeated overall.
In ACC.
But in ACC play, Notre Dame's undefeated, and then Notre Dame beats them again.
Interesting. Okay.
And it's because, and this is where I sort of go back to it, Notre Dame's quarterback has played Clemson before. So he's well acquainted with the ACC. Yeah. So it's not like you have some guy that's brand new, you're showing him under the light. Like he's played all these teams. He knows them. Now he's being surrounded with a way better talent. That's why I have Notre Dame winning the ACC.
See, I can see Florida State even possibly losing to LSU, but beating Clemson, and then Notre Dame also beating Clemson, and it's Florida State, Notre Dame in the ACC, and I think Florida State's going to win.
In neither one of those matchups, I would be mad about.
No.
Which, I mean, there's not a game that I'm not going to go watch, but ultimately, that's sort of what we both have. So then, Big Ten, who you got?
Big Ten's easy. It's whoever wins the game versus Wisconsin.
And I don't disagree.
And then I don't think Wisconsin can do it. In my opinion, I'm with you. I think it's Michigan beats Wisconsin, and Michigan is taking the Big Ten and going to the CFP.
And you may be mad at me, and others may be mad at me. I'm not even going to predict who wins the East because, as I would like to say, who cares? Because it doesn't matter. Whoever wins the game is winning the Big Ten.
Yeah.
Like, that is the ultimate. I'm telling you that right now. It's either Michigan or Ohio State.
I mean, because who was it last year? It was Purdue, wasn't it? And what was their record when they went to the Big 12 championship?
I think they were like 6-6 or something. Like it wasn't good. Like, and guess what? They got the bricks beat off them.
I mean, as they should have. We all knew it was going to happen.
I personally, and this is where I go back to who teams are. Now, this year, I believe that they get Ohio State at home. They got to go to the big house. Ohio State has to go to Michigan this year.
Yeah. I wish they adopted kind of like what the Pac-12 has done, and like where they don't have the separate divisions
anymore. You get your wish next year.
Yeah.
So once USC now the SEC has already announced they're going to the same thing, which I love.
It's way better that way.
It helps teams that sort of like a Tennessee that if they lose, just like they did up until South Carolina. They lose one game to Georgia, but they can't go to the SEC championship because Georgia's on their thing.
Exactly.
Like, Georgia wouldn't have wanted to play Tennessee again. Like, now the season happened like it happened. That will be eliminated in the future for the SEC and the Big Ten, and currently the Pac-12, which I actually like. And it's the same. The only conference that doesn't do it that way right now is the ACC. Which I think if the ACC wants to remain a conference, that's what they're going to change to. Like, you'll have to have a little bit more competition. But I've got Michigan coming out of the Big Ten. That's who my conference champ is. That's just the way I felt about them. I think they're the best team right now in college football until they're proven otherwise. Pac-12, who you got?
I mean, I'm going to say USC just because I'm biased. Obviously, I think we have the best offense, there. Our defense needs to show up, though. Like, I'll say USC in the hopes that they've figured it out in year 2, that all they got to do is just stop somebody one time. Like, just stop somebody one time, and your offense is going to win the game. Who they play, your guess is as good as mine. I mean, Utah, Washington. Honestly, I think it's Washington. I think Washington is the biggest threat this year. The problem is because they all play each other, it's just going to determine how that round robin figures itself out of Utah, Oregon, Washington, and USC, of who plays USC in the championship.
And that's for sure. I think that USC's there. Who they play, for me, if you had to put, as I always like to say, if you had to bet your house on it, who you picking of who to face USC, it's between Oregon and Washington. And right now, for me, my money's on Oregon. And it is just because I think that Oregon last year sort of they get a raw deal just sort of throughout this. Bo Nix gets hurt. They have some things go wrong for him. I step back and look at it and I say, Oregon doesn't have to start the season off with Georgia this year. They get time to warm up before they ever play USC. You take a look at their schedule. I mean, they don't play anyone until it's not until week 6 do they play at Washington, which I think determines what happens. I wouldn't be surprised. They get USC at home this year, which Eugene's a tough place to play. I think that USC plays Oregon in the championship, and I got USC winning too.
Yeah.
It is because of Caleb Williams.
Yeah,
that is
he's fantastic.
Yes, I can't. Now I think that they got some terrific guys on offense, and that's the thing. Lincoln Riley always has the ability to score at a moment's notice. Will they do the same this year? 100%. Lincoln Riley hasn't had a season where I sit back and they're not just absolutely.
It's a fun game to watch.
Yeah, they're putting up 50 points a game.
Yeah.
I think USC comes out of the Pac-12, but I do think that they have a loss, which will sort of tie in to where I think CFP-wise.
Yep, I agree.
They come out.
It's just too hard. It's too hard to survive that type of gauntlet that many weeks in a row.
Yeah, and then SEC, who you got in the championship, outside of Georgia, because I think we both, based upon their schedule.
It's going to sound boring, but it's Georgia-Bama. So I think they legitimately both get to the SEC championship undefeated.
Wow.
I can see Bama maybe losing to Texas. Now, if they lose to LSU, they probably won't. I mean, unless LSU drops a few games and somehow, Bama still takes, that side of the SEC. But I even if they lose to Texas, they're still going to have the SEC record because they'll beat LSU. Yeah. They'll still make it to the SEC championship. So I see Georgia making it to the SEC championship undefeated, Alabama being either one loss to possibly Texas or undefeated as well. And I think Bama gives it to them in the SEC championship. So I think Bama's going to take the SEC, but because Georgia's going to be undefeated and they're only going to have one loss to Alabama, who is going to be the SEC championship, I think this is another year where they send 2 SEC teams. And then, so it's like, who's on the outside looking in? Sorry, ACC. I don't see it happening. Like,
no better way to end the 14 playoff than 2 SEC teams getting in again.
I mean, it just kind of is what it is right now. So I don't think Florida State or Clemson really gets it done. Notre Dame somewhere in there is going to, mess things up. So I see Bama, Georgia, and then USC possibly has a loss to someone like Oregon or Washington. My bet would be like Washington. I think they're the higher threat this year. But I think SC then gets to avenge themselves in the Pac-12 championship against whatever team beats them. It could even be possibly Utah again, but I think it's going to be Washington this year. So I think USC beats Notre Dame, gets Notre Dame out, has a one loss going into their Pac-12 championship, beats Washington again. They get in, and then I think Michigan runs the table, so then Michigan gets in. So the 4 teams I have are going to be in order. Michigan 1, Bama 2, I would probably say Georgia 3, but because we've already seen what the committee will do by
they're not gonna make that matchup
putting
again.
the matchup unless they earn it, they're going to make USC 3 and then probably Georgia 4. So my matchup's going to be Michigan versus Georgia, and I think Michigan's going to win.
Dang.
So it's too hard to say three-peat, right? Like it's one of those like when it's never been done before, probabilities say that it won't be done.
What's been done, it's just not since 1939.
Sure, yeah. No,
that's not been done before just because like college football is completely different.
Exactly, right? So I'm going to say, Michigan beats Georgia. Bama, I think, is going to take down USC. I think it's going to be one of those games where Caleb Williams comes out and the offense is rolling, but like Bama's defense, I think, is just going to be a little bit too much where Alabama's offense is going to be just enough for a weaker USC defense, and Bama's gonna squeak out a win. So it's going to be Michigan-Bama in the Natty, and I think Michigan's going to take it home.
Man, so I mean, which would be huge. I mean, Michigan has failed to get over the hump of the CFP first game. It's like they finish the game with Ohio State every year, and then they fall flat.
But here's how I see it. Like if you look at, and I'm not saying this is like the new Big Ten where like all of a sudden the Big Ten's going to start running it. But if you look at like historically when teams start to become dominant, it takes them a few years. Like they're good, but they just don't quite have it. Next year they maybe make it a little bit farther, but they just still quite don't have it. And then it's like boom, they hit a wall, and all of a sudden like the Florida, all of a sudden, bam, 2 national championships in 3 years. Bama does the same thing after they kind of dethrone Florida, right? And then like the SEC is kind of dominant as a group. It kind of goes back and forth, LSU, Bama, and then Georgia comes in, right? Georgia had been kind of getting good all the way up until bam, now they went back-to-back national championships, right? And I think this is that year that Michigan has kind of the last couple years. They finally beat Ohio State. They finally win the Big Ten, right? Like the next step for them, and I think it's this next year because of how many people they're bringing back, is that next step where they win the Natty, and all of a sudden it's like, all right, now Michigan is the team to beat.
It's bold, especially, I mean, it would be huge for Michigan. You got Harbaugh doing the 3-game suspension to start off the year, at least right now, self-imposed by Michigan. We'll see how the NCAA rules. They probably won't change anything just because the NCAA doesn't like punishing teams that have a chance.
Yeah, it's too good for TV and ratings. They've got to wait until everybody leaves, and then they'll punish the team later.
Yeah, they'll strip Michigan of the national title after the year because that's what the NCAA does. Just dumb stuff like that. For me, when I take a look at the SEC, I know it's boring for the podcast, but I have the exact same matchup in Bama, Georgia. I take a look at it, and it's tough because I think both teams have brand new quarterbacks. That's I already talked about. For me, both teams are the exact same. New offensive coordinators, new quarterbacks, rebuild offensive lines. Both defenses are there. And so when I take a look, it's tough to give the edge, and I get it. It may be Bama bias of giving Kirby the edge, and it's more because of history. Like in terms of we want to look at history of Kirby and the Bulldogs and say they've won the last 2 and they beat Alabama in the first national championship that they won in this 2-peat. However, when you take a look at prior to that, that was the first time Kirby's beat the mentor, and it's tough. He's 3-1.
Well, before Kirby, no previous coach of Saban had ever come back and beat him, right?
Well, that year, Jimbo had beat him.
Oh, okay.
Against Texas A&M. So that was the first year that
I knew it was rare. Like coaches of Saban's don't come back and beat Saban. It's just a thing.
And there was a bunch of different hurdles through that year that when you take a look and you look at the context, you go, it was the first time that Bama had lost to an unranked opponent. It was the first time he had lost to a previous, one of his coachees that left, a part of that coaching tree. There were so many things that led to it, but up to that point, even after the Natty and they lose, Kirby's 1-3 against Saban. So odds say, it's still
Bama still is the better, more dominant team.
And I have to believe that Bama this year, it's one of those ones for me. The SEC championship, I would hate to play Bama in it.
Yeah, right. Like they're hungry. Like for 365 days, they have been like, we want revenge. And
Yeah, and they're being doubted.
In college, like that motivates those guys, and they come out and show it sometimes.
Because if they go into the SEC championship, I have to believe that if Georgia's still undefeated, Georgia's the favorite. Which it plays into like Saban's rat poison, everything.
Yeah.
Like everything has led to this moment where it's like, you want to prove that you're the best team? Go prove it.
That's their goal from day one, right? Like they've got Georgia's pictures on their lockers probably going like, we want Georgia and we're going to take them down in the championship.
And that's how I think it plays out. I do think that Georgia takes a loss. Now, my CFP gets a lot more dicey, and I'm about to say some bold things, and it's not hate towards Georgia about what I'm trying to say, but I'll explain it. I think Michigan runs the table and goes undefeated through the regular season. I think that them being number 2, doing that, they are now going to be the number 1 team in the nation.
Okay.
So they're my CFP number 1. I personally think Bama beating an undefeated Georgia is going to put them at 2.
Okay.
So Bama goes to number 2. That sort of makes sense.
So you got Michigan, Bama, just like me, as 1-2.
1-2. I also have USC as number 3, and I am in the same boat. I just think that throughout the Pac-12 schedule, I have to believe that they take a loss somewhere, but I think it works out the exact same way. Either they play the same team again, or Washington beats Oregon and they lose to Oregon, but they play Washington in the Pac-12.
Yeah,
so it's like it's this muddled thing where it's either clear cut they beat the team that beat them, or they'll beat a team that they lost to.
Sure.
It will be some type of scenario. But I think that, for me, taking a look at USC, I think the reason they're going to get the nod as long as they have one loss but win the conference championship, this is the first year that Lincoln Riley has had his Heisman Trophy winner
come back.
Yeah. So I think that Caleb Williams is going off. Like, you look at their offense, they only get better from last year. I think he's putting up Heisman numbers again. That's personally who my pick is. I think he'll be the first one since Archie Griffin to win it again. Win again.
Yeah.
I've got USC at 3. Now this is where it takes a turn for me, and it's funny to say this, and it's more. There's a lot of explanation that goes behind it. I'll try to keep it short. I think Notre Dame only has one loss the whole year, and
USC.
To USC.
Okay.
I think they beat Ohio State early in the, it's about middle of the year, but Ohio State having a brand new quarterback, I just think it works out for Wake Forest having this, or the Wake Forest transfer in.
Yeah.
I think that Notre Dame has some success with him. I can see them dropping it to USC just because of USC's offense.
Sure.
I don't think Notre Dame's going to be able to keep up, but they beat Clemson, and I think they see Clemson again.
Ooh, man.
That's
a
ACC.
tough decision for the committee, having a one-loss Notre Dame to the Pac-12 champ versus a one-loss Georgia to the SEC champ.
Exactly.
Wow.
And this is where the committee, I think, really gets tested to say,
this is where Georgia's schedule is going to hurt them.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's where I sit back and I'm like, I don't see if Notre Dame has that one loss to the Pac-12 champ but beats Ohio State. Now, Ohio State at this point, I think, has 2 losses. They lost to Notre Dame and Michigan. Yeah. But still, I think that Ohio State's like a top 10 team.
Yeah, like if Clemson's only losses to Notre Dame, let's say somehow Tennessee doesn't turn out to be as good as they are. Now Georgia's big wins maybe don't look as big as they were, like, because they really only have the 2 games of South Carolina and Tennessee, and if both those teams don't show up and aren't hard opponents, maybe Georgia's schedule looks even weaker than it does right now.
Yeah, because for me, I think Florida State beats LSU to start the year off.
Okay.
And then they lose at Clemson. So Clemson has the schedule of like, we only lost to Notre Dame, but we beat the hype team of FSU.
It play out.
It puts them in a scenario, and it would be, it'd be great TV for, they're always going to make it drama, like no matter what. Like they have to sell that announcement show as they do every year.
I would love to see that happen, not to like see Georgia get kicked out or anything. I legitimately don't see that happening just because of the recency bias of SEC and the cahoots that ESPN and SEC are in. Like if it ever came down to a very equitable where just a fan would say, hey, these are pretty equal, which I think that's a pretty good comparison. That's about as close as you could probably get there. They're always going to give the nod to the SEC team. But that's a great bold
last year
prediction. Hot take.
Now I get last year Bama had 2 losses and Ohio State only had 1. They did. I think that people wouldn't have been shocked if they put Bama in, but I think people were almost shocked that they did put Ohio State in, that they finally didn't go with the bias, because I think a lot of
again though, you're not even comparing apples to apples in that situation.
This one is just straight 1 loss versus 1 loss. Yeah. One's in the SEC championship, one's during the regular season. But because I think that if they punish Notre Dame, it sort of puts Notre Dame in this position of well, then why are we going and playing these schools?
That's been my argument against the CF, the committee this entire time, because it's you don't have to actually play anybody as long as you can just say, hey, I'm in the SEC and get in. That's the way it works.
And that would be the thing for Georgia.
When
this
Bama
year.
got in without even llaying in their conference championship with 2 losses,
it worked out.
Again, it worked out. People were see, that's why you put the best team in. But at the same day, it's you got to win to get there. You don't just
they didn't get in with 2 losses. It was just they lost to Auburn there at the end of the year.
Right,
Auburn. That was a make or break game for the SEC.
I guess what I would have said though is if they did make this college football, or if they made the SEC championship, then they maybe would have lost to Georgia. I don't know. You're right. I said 2 losses, but they didn't even have the game on the schedule. Auburn was essentially playing an extra week.
Yeah,
and it hurt them for being in their conference championship, which is bizarre to me.
It drove fans wild, but then I think fans would hold that more over everyone if Bama didn't win.
Yeah.
But then they won, and so people were just left with this the committee got it right. So for me, it's Michigan's playing Notre Dame, Alabama's playing USC. I think Michigan runs away with it.
Okay.
And not in terms of just blowing them out. I just think that Michigan this is where bringing back guys helps. When you have returning players, them having their starting quarterback, having both of those running backs, I think that Corum.
Yeah.
I think he's with Caleb Williams looking at the Heisman in terms of the race. I'd give the nod to Caleb Williams just because
it's a quarterback trophy right now. Yeah.
So I think both of them go. I think Michigan edges them out. Just defense. It's early for Notre Dame. They have a brand new coach. I can see it with the second year.
I'll tell you what, if that happens, I hope they find a way to get a bowl game up into the Midwest, because Michigan, Notre Dame in December or January,
at Lambeau,
get some snow going. Yeah, that would be a great playoff game.
People would go, and this is total side note. I wish that under the 12-team format, they're going to make it to where before that top 4 matchup plays, you're playing at your home stadium, which I can't imagine anything better.
That's college football, baby.
Yes.
That is the heart of college football.
For you to have one more game, fans, that will be the biggest advantage there is, because up to this point, you've never been able to play a bowl game or a champion anything related to a championship at home outside of the regular season, which will be phenomenal. And I think that you'll start to see the NCAA with the success of how it will go. I think that you'll see it maybe all the way up until the top 4 matchups. And then, that the game to get into the championship will become a neutral field, but we'll see. So I got Michigan beaten going to the championship. And then the other side, you got Bama and USC. And this is, for me, it hurts me to say this.
We won't be friends that week.
That will be an interesting podcast. I sit back and I have to give the nod to USC.
Wow.
And I'll explain it as a Bama fan.
So Bama fan picks USC in the Bama-USC matchup. Yeah. USC fan picks Bama in the USC matchup. We're self-deprecating. I get it.
Yeah. I just take a look at it and I say, when I look at when Bama has struggled, who is it against? And it's against really good quarterbacks that can run and are maneuverable.
Manziel nightmares.
Yeah, Manziel, Cam Newton,
Joe
Burrow, all these guys that I just sit back and I'm like, oh. And tall, wide receivers. Bama, when you look at their corners, they produce guys to the league, but when you watch them, it is so frustrating because they never turn and find the ball. They are watching the guy and putting their hands up, and they get called for so many pass interferences. It is a struggle. And Saban coaches the DBs. I think that it translates well to the pros, and it makes them better pros because they're watching this guy and they're able to maneuver. They can get that teaching later, and it makes them very predictable in Bama. But when they get against big guys in high tempo offenses, the last time they saw Oklahoma, if Bama hadn't gotten up like they did in that playoff game, Kyler Murray brings them all the way back.
Yeah.
Like they're eating, they are driving in on Bama consistently. I just think this time, I don't see their defense stopping them. And now with Bama not having Bryce Young, having a reduced offense, I don't see them putting up 45 to 50 points against USC.
Well, let me look it up real fast so I can see who's the tallest USC wide receiver and what kind of day he's gonna have.
I mean, Branch is the guy, and then we were talking about him the other day.
Dorian Singer's only 6 foot.
Okay, well, I mean, still, Bama loves 6 foot less wide receivers.
Brendan Rice, which is Jerry Rice's son, he's 6'3".
Yeah,
so I mean,
a big guy. And what's Zachariah Branch? Like he's the number one wide receiver in the class, freshman this year, which I get a lot on a freshman, but freshmen have shown up in big games before. I would know with
he's only 5'10".
Wow. Okay, so maybe not as big as I thought, but that's my gut is that USC edges it out. We talk about the Bama on the decline. I do get that. I just think that for them, it's that hangover game. Like, and Bama hasn't been the same Bama. And until I see that, now, if I'll edit this as the season goes on. If I see that defense that just like is out for blood.
Yeah, that's like faster than everybody else on the field and hits harder than everybody else on the field. Yeah.
Where you sort of get the idea that it's like, they're not trying to like not let them score. They're trying to take people's souls. Like when you see that type of defense again, I'll be more inclined to be like, I want nothing to do with Bama. But I think that mantra has changed right now because I do see it in Georgia.
Like, I was it looks like Georgia's defense, how they have been the last 2 years. Yeah,
no one wants to go play Georgia, but Bama is in this weak spot, and that's the key for me. Like with Saban and everything else, is this year. Like if they can start to change, they can't let that start to become a thing where it's like, Bama's not the same Bama. If they can reestablish that dominance and people don't want to play them, that's all they need to do to continue the dynasty. But if they start to let that keep slipping in as they have the past 2 years, it's the start of Rome falling.
So you've got Michigan USC in the final then.
Yep.
Is there going to be a Rose Bowl game?
The granddaddy of them all, which I can't think of a more historic matchup with Michigan and USC. And this is where I think that due to the running attack, due to Lincoln Riley, I think their defense is better than it was last year, but not to y'all. I forget what the name of that defensive tackle y'all had last year. Like if he was returning, I would give USC more. That dude, he was wrecking shop.
Tui Tuipulotu, whatever.
Yes, what a monster. Yeah. Like his play won games for USC last year, like alone on the defense. Like he was a one-man wrecking crew. I think that this is where Michigan just drives it down their throat. Like consistently beats to the point that when it gets to the second half, third and fourth quarter, like I can see Michigan's
no Moss.
Yeah, no Moss. Like please stop. Like, and I think they just run all over them. Like I'm talking like 200 to 300 yards rushing.
Wow.
And I think Michigan wins. I think so it's funny we both have the same champ of Michigan. We different in how they get there, but I put a lot of weight into the fact that when you have a returning offense, it really helps. I know as a Bama fan, I've seen it multiple years where when a new guy comes in, it usually does take Bama a few weeks to figure it out. They usually suffer a loss with a new guy. Yeah. And then it's how that team responds are they just a team that you don't want to be messed with by the end of the year? But last year you have the Heisman Trophy winner and it's not the same team. Like, there was a lot of question marks, and until those question marks are answered. So we both got Michigan. I think that's sort of where we're at, but we'll see how it works out. We'll keep track of it, and I'm sure through the year as I have at least we're not dumb enough like Desmond Howard to be like Texas A&M's going to the CFP, like or Baylor.
Did he really say that?
My gosh. 2 years ago. Last year. So last year's CFP, he had Baylor and Texas A&M.
Oh my gosh.
In the CFP, and I think even the guys on game day were just like
trying to scoot out of frame.
Yeah, like, yo, dog, like, can we say this on national TV? So at least we have 4 reputable teams. The likelihood that I would say we get 2 in there is difficult. So ultimately, both of us are going to be dead wrong.
Yeah, watch. It's going to be Ohio State, LSU, Florida State.
And Texas.
Yeah, and Texas.
And you're just like, well, didn't get any of it right. And then we'll look like idiots. But, ultimately, I think that sort of wraps up our college football episode. We're going to do a few other episodes coming out. We're going to take a review of Swamp Kings, the new Netflix documentary on the Florida Gators. I think it's some interesting takes that we sort of had some ideas about. And, it's just football, and that's all we do. We talk football all year long. So that'd be a preview of the next episode, and I think we're also going to do one on Reggie Bush. There's some Heisman
might be a quick
drama.
talk about some Heisman drama there.
Yeah, that'll be we'll call it a mini podcast that we'll do a little episode on. But outside of that, you got anything else?
Nope. Appreciate you guys for watching.
Cool. Thanks for joining us. Time to pull chalks. We'll see you next week.